Dr. Angela Hardin is back on the Herbal Hour podcast. And with no preliminary conversation to start, we're just jumping straight in. So,
We're just going for it.
Dr. Hardin, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. How are you?
Pretty good, yeah. I've been realizing a lot how the mind interferes with life, how either thinking good things or thinking bad things about what's happening both interfere from the experience of life.
Totally. We get in our own way all the time.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking today a little bit about the mystical realms again.
Mm-hmm.
And a topic that I wanted to touch on a little bit that you brought up as well is energy vampires.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what is that in your view? Because I have my own kind of view
Yeah.
of it psychologically, what that could mean and whether it's like an actual literal thing. What's your take on energy?
Yeah. So this has been an interesting thing for me to think about, especially sort of, I'm applying it now to my life, sort of in the context of being a healthcare provider where you interface with all kinds of people and patients. But as I've started to learn what that looks like from a healthcare provider's perspective, I also realize, looking back on my life, what kinds of people kind of drain your energy, whether or not that's their intention. So, and how does an energy vampire, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is, or what that can look like, or what types of people might be doing this. But also, how do those types of people affect really highly sensitive people like empaths? So I wanted to bring that into the conversation specifically because I think that a lot of us who go into healthcare, we can be highly sensitive people. We have typically a goal to serve humanity, to connect with people, to understand somebody's suffering. And a lot of times we put ourselves in, of course, the patient is in a vulnerable situation sharing those things with us. But we can also be very vulnerable to that person's suffering and maybe even taking on their suffering. And so, that's sort of talking about it in this container of healthcare and the doctor-patient relationship. But certainly we can expand that to all of life. And I just realizing over the years of my life how highly sensitive I am, and arguably have become more sensitive with time, and sort of tying it back to the intuition piece that we were talking about in part one of our conversation. An empath is typically a highly sensitive person, and typically is somebody who you might think of as being highly intuitive. So they're very, for lack of a better term, they're tuned in. They may be picking up on things, aspects, feelings, suffering in another person without that person verbally communicating that to them. So something about the empath or the highly sensitive person, the intuitive person, and I don't mean highly sensitive in the sense that their feelings are hurt easily, but rather somebody who, without having to either see with their own eyes or hear, or using something other than their five senses. And we talked a little bit about sort of distinguishing sensation or sensory from intuition, and theoretically those two things are opposite, but I like to think of them as maybe just intuition being a little bit more expanded sensation or sensory. Not that it's necessarily different, but we live in such a tangible world, in a material world, so we need many of us need sort of validation that things are true through being able to touch them, being able to see them, to prove that they exist. But
Yeah.
sometimes
Mhm.
you just sense something else about that might be going on with a person. You might all of a sudden take on that person's symptoms by being in a room with them and just being open, or having poor boundaries, or, you know, for all sorts of reasons. You
Mm.
may, as a highly sensitive person, an intuitive person, or an empath, whatever label you want to put on it, um, may start to almost have a sense of more than you want to know. You know, sometimes these messages or these feelings don't necessarily come through when we are asking for them, or at least consciously ready to take that on, or ready to know what to do with that information. But we go into sort of a healing space, we go into the room with a patient, or we go into a social situation, or it might be with, you know, a family member, or whatever it is. Maybe we see someone on the street, and we feel for that person, we want to help them. that is our that is our sort of natural inclination. You might call it a bleeding heart, um, or, you know, a humanitarian. Those types of people tend to be empaths.
Mm.
So they feel very deeply. It doesn't mean they're like weak. It doesn't mean they're, you know, easily offended, like I said earlier. It's that they feel very deeply. And the challenge here is that, you know, we can take on suffering of another and have a difficulty distinguishing where do we end and this other person begins in as far as an energetic field from that standpoint. um, and that can make the water very muddy. So
Mm.
I sort of wanted to dive into that a little bit, because, you know, it's so relevant as healthcare providers and healers, regardless of what type of provider you are. If you're going to work closely with an individual, with the goal to help them through something, whether it's a physical health ailment, an emotional, mental health support that they need, whether it is not even your job, but you are sort of that person in your family that everybody comes to asking for help, or you are that person in your group of friends, or you might be dealing with difficulty in the workplace. But let's expand it even bigger to look what's going on with, at least in our country, and how things have become so ramped up over the last several months. And there, of course, is, you know, the highly sensitive person, the empath, wants so much to show love, to help, and yet can feel very drained very quickly from um, sort of being exposed to, you know, outright hate, outright racism. You know, we can expand it to like what's going on around us now. We want to do something, and yet we feel paralyzed we may feel paralyzed by how deeply upsetting it is. And I think that everybody is being affected in some way by what is happening in our world right now. A lot has been stirred up, but certainly everybody's going to react and act differently in response to this. But I think it's important that those of us who are highly sensitive, and I just say us because I include myself in that statement, and, you know,
Mhm.
maybe some of the listeners can relate to that, is, you know, sort of helping and advocating and supporting others can look like many different things. and we also need to take care of ourselves so that we don't make ourselves sick from how deeply we are feeling the pain of the world.
Mm.
Um, so what do you think about all that? Do you
Yeah,
feel
a
like
lot of
you're,
you
yeah,
brought up a lot of really good points. One
yeah.
thing that I was thinking of that got brought up to me, which is very empowering in a sense, from a healer's perspective. So there's this idea that when you sit and you listen to someone's problems, that, you know, you kind of take them onto yourself, and they kind of, you know, weigh you down, they make you upset, etc. So there's this cliche of the psychiatrist is depressed because all they do is see depressed patients. There was a big insight I heard from a clinical psychologist. What he said is that when you're a physician and a patient is in front of you, there's a fundamental difference from those kind of what might be called energetic vampirism of somebody, you know, where they just unleash all their problems, they just vent to you.
Mhm.
The key difference between those two scenarios is the patient in a lot of cases actually wants to be helped. So they're venting all the problems, but they're doing it with the mind of, well, what do you think? You know, I'm in
Mhm.
this terrible situation. This is what's happening. How can I get out of it? Whereas the more draining kind of relationship to be in with someone is someone who is constantly complaining, but they actually don't want to solve their problems at all. And that's not even what they're seeking from you. That
Mhm.
is what seems to drain the life very quickly. I'm sure you
That,
know people like that.
that's a really good distinction. And I do want to come back to the energy vampire piece because, you know, I talked a little bit more about the empath piece and the highly sensitive person piece, and we can certainly expand on both, but I do want to come back to what you're saying because it's very essential to understand that, yes, it is about what is the intention of that individual, um, who is, you know, maybe it's important for us as healthcare providers to make this distinction as well, because certainly, um, you know, I do believe that every human um, deserves medical care and healthcare and access to that. And there are many patients, and many of them that we see in our profession, who have been sort of, for lack of a better word or a better term, they've been let down by the healthcare system. And somewhere along the line, you know, maybe this is someone with a chronic illness and a complex medical history, and they've been let down by the medical system. And maybe that's been the conventional system, just because the doctors don't have enough time to give them in a visit and they need a lot of attention. And somewhere along the line, someone called them a difficult patient.
Mm,
That is sort of how they lump. And I've done it. I'm guilty of doing that. I have patients that I have called difficult. And um, on the one hand, that's not fair for me to say. But I like the distinction that you made because, and I'm not saying that we need to deny healthcare to anybody, right?
mm,
That's sort of part of our oath that we take as a physician. We don't deny access to care.
yep.
Um, and if we were to try to get a patient fired from being our patient, there are steps you must go through so that that can happen.
Mm,
You can't refuse to see somebody unless certain things have occurred. And we don't have to get into what that is, but, you know, as a provider, we sort of have a duty. Yes, there are certain patients that are better suited for certain providers, 100%. It's important that a patient is able to work with a provider that they feel drawn to, they have a connection with, they feel heard. There's a therapeutic relationship. But I like what you said, because in the instance where the patient or the energy vampire um, is not acting with the intent of making themselves better, or adding something positive to the relationship, it is no longer a therapeutic relationship. So we
Mm,
talk about doctor and patient relationship, and the understanding that we should be, as physicians, we should engage in a therapeutic relationship with our patient, and that doesn't just mean that the doctor provides care,
mm.
right? So it is a two-way street.
You have to
And
sympathize with the patient to some degree, but otherwise you can't really meet them where they are.
mhm,
Like, for example, I had a patient who had very severe kind of end stage liver cancer, and I really allowed myself to feel what would
mhm,
it feel like to be coming to the doctor looking for an alternate option for something that other doctors are telling you you have maybe 6 months to live
mm,
from a year, and feeling that is very distressing actually, and it really puts you in your place like nothing else possibly can as a healer of any sense, because it puts you in front of a problem that you just aren't experiencing now,
mhm,
but it's a fundamental human problem. And I think that's what makes it so interesting. And what you say about the difficult patient, I also like that.
mhm.
So there's the difficult patient, and then there's the energetic vampire, which is actually the impossible patient, because they
Indeed.
don't want to be helped, so it doesn't matter if you try to. And
Mhm.
that's actually interesting. That's the basis of some portion of romantic relationships.
And that is exactly where I wanted to go with this, because we can put all of this in the bubble and say, yes, as a doctor, as a future doctor, you have a duty to your patient. And it's sort of like, in a sense, your patient has to sort of fail to act in a certain accordance, in order to not be your patient anymore. Um, and yet we don't need to have that same duty to someone else if we are not talking about the doctor patient relationship. And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that in a doctor patient relationship that the physician has to suffer through a difficult patient. There are ways to put up boundaries, either by ways of communicating with the patient, energetic boundaries, which we can also talk about, um, even body language. There's a lot of subtleties, and I urge us all to find out whatever that looks like for us as individuals, and use those practices in between every patient if you can, um, because at the end of a work day, you end up carrying a lot of that shit home with you,
Mm-hmm.
and you end up coming home and you're like, man, I've only seen a few patients today and I can barely function. And I've had a lot of those days, especially when I was a student doing clinical rotations and seeing patients. And I was just like that bleeding heart, like, oh, I want to see the good in everybody, right? I want to help them so bad. I want to dive in and do all of this. I'm so excited for the bright eye, bushy tailed. Well, it only took a year or so for me to realize that's not sustainable. It doesn't mean that I put up a wall and don't let
Mm.
anybody in, but we have to, through trial and error, kind of figure out where our boundary is, where we can still have that connection, and figure out
Mm.
what do those boundaries look like for you. But and we can go back to that, because I want to talk more about how to establish those boundaries and how they can look different. But with the romantic thing that you bring up, or just the social aspect, we don't have a duty unless maybe they're your family member, and then you're kind of SOL. You got to deal with them, or you don't, and you're estranged from family members, and that's a really difficult thing in and of itself. And I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't wish that upon anybody, but I understand that sometimes family members become at odds. They can't, what one or both members of the party can't deal with the other, and people, you know, even families are torn apart. I don't like that as, you know, sort of that end result, but you can't fault people for having to take space when they need it. That's their own version of a boundary.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they'll work through it if at some point, if they can. But when it comes to choosing partners, choosing friendships, choosing, even as you know, sort of distilled down as choosing your battles, right? Choosing what types of conversations you choose to engage in when you do have that choice to bow out or not. Sometimes you're in a conversation with somebody and you can't get out of it. You can't just walk away, but you can choose, you know, how you respond, of course. And I don't know, when I think of energy vampire, I think of, there's a newer show that's, I think, based on a movie. I never saw the movie, but the show is What We Do in the Shadows. And it's like a parody about vampires. It's a comedy, a sort of a dark comedy. And one of the characters, so like, you know, there's 3 vampires that go around doing vampire things. And then the other character is an energy vampire, which is hilarious because he walks into a room, he has a super flat affect, a very dull personality, and his superpower
Classic.
is to walk into a room
And just sap it of its
and
energy.
drain the energy from everybody in that
Oh.
room by talking about whatever BS.
I think we call that a wet blanket in slang terms. Someone just comes in and is just
and then you
killing the vibe,
and
man. What's up with
this
you
guy's
today?
going on and on about whatever, some spreadsheet, some commercial he saw, some way he irons his
Stocks.
pants, like stocks, shit no one cares about. And you see everyone else in the room and they're struggling to stay awake, and he's loving it.
Yeah, and they're listening only out of
raining
politeness. They're just
and he
like,
grows,
yeah.
and he
Right.
grows stronger and stronger as they get weaker and weaker. So that is like, that's sort of like, think of that, you know, caricature. And this is sort of a touchy subject in a sense, because oftentimes it ends up looking like narcissistic personalities. It ends up being, you know, personality disorders, character disorders. If you look at the DSM textbook for mental, just, you know, mental health disorders, you end up looking at what's called cluster B personality disorders. And, you know, this is tricky because, you know, I have patients who have personality disorders. I don't deny them the care that they need or that they ask for. However, knowing that I'm a highly sensitive person, I have to exercise extreme boundaries that I learned the hard way in a doctor-patient setting with every patient, but especially with patients with, you know, personality disorders, because those individuals can drain energy, and especially from a highly sensitive person. And so, you know, I've never denied care from those individuals, but I quickly found out that I had to change how I was responding to them, because it's very easily for interactions to escalate if all of a sudden you are taking everything personally that they say, because that is how they get their power, you could say. But, you know, in a personal setting, it's so tricky because they can be difficult personalities, and it doesn't mean that they don't deserve help and care,
Mm.
but just being aware of what that looks like, and especially in personal relationships. Um,
Are there any cases that you can think of where you had somebody with a personality disorder and there was something particularly that was difficult about it? What what was the
yeah.
difficulty?
So, and I think a lot of this comes from my own tendency and my own personality to react in ways I would react to certain comments made by another person.
Mm.
So, um, often a borderline personality disorder can almost have like an accusatory type of language that they use,
Mm.
where um, it's very easy for them to misunderstand somebody else's intention. It's very easy for them to assume that they are the victim and being attacked um, by something that you might say that you don't feel is an attack. So I remember a few instances where I realized that my response to what they had to say was going to be the difference between escalating and de-escalating a conversation with them. And certainly people that don't have personality disorders can also act in this way. I don't want to single that group out as, oh, these are the bad people and everyone else is fine. Not at all. I just want to talk about sort of the spectrum of what this can look like and
Hmm.
how interactions can become very toxic very quickly, and just sort of understanding um, that the intent is not always, it's not always positive from people. So um, I would say the number one thing that I learned in those interactions was, rather than responding with um, it's almost like you just kind of figure out how to masterfully redirect
Hmm.
them. You're always redirecting. And um, instead of meeting their comment head on with a logical response, or even like sort of a sarcastic remark, which is what I was very, very tempted to do, and in some instances even tried to explain myself to them, it doesn't matter. And I would say that in sort of an energy vampire situation, they are taking power from you, draining energy from you to cut you down to size for whatever reason. Um, and redirection and sort of de-escalating as best as you can. I
Mm.
mean, sometimes it literally comes down to, in my mind, I'm thinking, this conversation took a turn that doesn't make logical sense. This person feels attacked by what I have said, and choosing your words is very like being intentional, choosing your words with how you respond. And instead of responding to a comment like, well, how could you have thought that this was my fault? How could you have blamed me for this? A patient said to me once, when I said, I think the thing I said was, oh, I'm sorry that, what did I say? I'm trying to remember what my exact comment was that set them off. I said, I'm sorry that you were upset by this. And they immediately turned it around and said, I can't believe you're putting this on me. And so I thought, oh, okay, I need to redirect, or think, if I come across a similar situation in the future, how can I use language that doesn't put anything on them, but is extremely neutral? And I also don't necessarily want to put it on me either, because that puts me in a sort of inferior position. And it's not like I'm trying to be above them, but I also don't want to completely shy away or back down either. So it's sort of a delicate balance, because you don't want to, your version of a boundary, you don't want to just completely roll over and let them verbally abuse you, because that's not really productive either. But you can learn tactful ways to establish a boundary and redirect when you have to, because a lot of times there isn't a lot of logic in the conversation, in the actual narrative. You can try to logic with them all you want, and it doesn't matter. You end up draining your own energy by trying to convince them that, no, you misunderstood this. All I was trying to do was this. Just skip that altogether. You don't even necessarily, obviously it depends on the circumstance, it depends on the conversation, but you don't necessarily need to explain yourself. You just move on and say, tell me about this. If they're willing to move on with you, which hopefully they are, then do that. Do that whenever you can, and not even get into the nitty-gritty of why they felt attacked. If you end up in a situation where they're wanting to rehash it, which could definitely happen, where they say, no, I'm offended, I don't want to talk to you anymore, you're attacking me, I'm the victim, that kind of narrative, then you can sort of go back to I guess it's sort of like that Spikes protocol. We learned it, like how to deliver bad news, how to deal with a difficult situation, where it's a little bit of motivational interviewing and a little bit of like reflective conversation, where you say to them, I can see how much this upsets you. You can try that. It might work. Kind of opening up the conversation for them to say what they need to say. So it's not that we're always necessarily trying to redirect and cut them off, because that can aggravate them as well. But we want to give them the space to say what they needed to say. And if we can find any way to sort of soften them and gain trust. I remember having to do this with a patient who was very paranoid and had, I was worried had a head injury, but had also had some mood disorder and potential personality disorder that she was absolutely not willing to talk about as a diagnosis, but just sort of knowing that that was on the table. And one time, and I'd seen her for months and months and months, and all of a sudden she came in and she told me that she'd hit her head and she was acting differently. And I wanted her to leave in an ambulance so she could go get imaging, just to make sure that that time she bumped her head wasn't responsible for why she was acting that way. And she had such mistrust for the medical system, and she was a veteran, and she'd understandably had a traumatic history and didn't trust anything that was going on. And I just told her, how long have I known you? How many months have I known you? I haven't ever put you in harm's way, and that's not my intention now. And you find a way as best you can, if you have a relationship or sort of a history with that person, you try to get them to trust you. Whether it's in you as the doctor or whatever the situation may be. If it's a new person that you're meeting, it's a lot more difficult, because they don't have a reason to trust you. They're convinced that the world is against them. And in those situations, it is often very difficult to help them, because their own personal goals of healing are not clear. And what you try, treatments, approaches for them, they will many times have resistance to that. They will come in with a laundry list of complaints. They want you to address it all that day. They have an agenda and they want you to follow it, and they will tell you what they want you to do. And it's tough, but it will kind of force you to establish your own boundaries. Okay, where is my line?
Mm.
And at what point do I need to assert that line, remind them of the line? And in a sense, I remember a doctor talking about this once, just this topic of personality disorders and how we can interface with them in the clinical setting and not be drained by those interactions. And the distinction is that we still give love to those people. We want the best for them because they're human, but we can't give personal love to them. We have to give divine love. And that might seem esoteric because it's like, well, what does that mean? But what it means is you're not giving your own personal love. You're not giving your energy. You're not even putting expectations on them that could be disappointed later. You're not putting your heart and soul into the outcome, because divine love is a neutral place that is not up to you as the healer, as the doctor, as
Mm-hmm.
the person who is helping them. It's not up to you to decide. If that person doesn't want to be helped, it doesn't matter what you do, you can't help them. So it seems a little bit like a black and white situation, but I want to help, I guess, demystify this whole scenario, because it's true. Doctors go through burnout, and I believe it's because we don't always have sort of like the discussions of how do we set up boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Not only how do we get through our charts for the day, or how do we get through paperwork, or how do we see patients every 15 minutes, but how do we also energetically handle some of these personalities?
Mm. Yeah. On the topic of boundaries, it seems that setting boundaries is not necessarily what's difficult, but knowing what your boundaries actually are, knowing
Yeah.
where you actually stand. And to even know where you stand, you have to know yourself. And that takes a long time,
Mm-hmm.
because you also have to be aware of your own patterns. So
Mm-hmm.
with the idea of it takes two to tango, kind of with like an empath and maybe like a narcissistic or energy vampire type-ish person, is that they essentially feed off each other. They give each other something that they seek. They reiterate a certain version of reality. It ends up being toxic for both of them. It's actually an interesting thing to think about in terms of what would be like an empathic personality from a psychological sense, especially when it's pathological. Like if the empathy is like pathological, like trying to rescue, trying to save everybody around them, even
Mm-hmm.
people who clearly don't want it, especially the people who don't want it. Those are the people usually that are sought out the most. And I wonder how much that has to do with kind of early childhood development, where someone grows up in a very unsafe environment and they have to almost be like hyper aware of their caregivers every subtle emotion, because they have to predict far ahead, oh, how will this way that I act affect them? And they think of the whole world in terms of, you know, how their actions influence the world, but in a very kind of introverted and kind of defensive way, rather than thinking first of what are my needs and how do I make sure to get those met, thinking first what are the other person's needs, or what do I need to do to keep myself safe from them. And I think that kind of goes into, I mean, with all things, it's balance, right? So you can be like pathologically empathic and pathologically um, apathetic, basically. Like you could either give no F's about anybody, which is not really a healthy mind state, or you could care so much that you burn yourself out, and you're caring so much about people who you can't even necessarily really help, and they're both kind of continuums.
Well,
So,
so one thing, oh, I don't want to interrupt you, but one thing you said made
mhm.
me think about how both parties, they're not good for each other. So clearly the empath or the highly sensitive individual, interestingly enough, as much as the empath wants to reach out to humanity and help everybody, the empath often does not meet or does not have attract a lot of like-minded individuals much of the time. It doesn't mean that we can't find our people, but and I've wondered about this a lot, because I was like, why am I always attracting people who have personality disorders? Why am I always attracting the people who want to dump all of their problems on me? Why is this? And it makes sense to me as far as I'm giving them something that they need, which is either someone to just listen, and that's sometimes all it is. There's no malintent behind it. Other times it is, I just need the energy from someone else who cares. Whether or not it's malintended, it's still what it is. However, the empath, often, like what you're saying, they want to fix everyone, even those that don't want to be fixed. The empath often becomes the enabler, and the energy vampire doesn't change their habits, because tough love can be very effective.
Mhm.
Empaths don't like tough love. It's very difficult.
It involves
And
conflict usually, or
it
at least the
involves
threat of conflict always.
conflict, which is very uncomfortable for an empath. And I'm using these labels just to make things simpler, not to say that there's a lot that can exist in between. Of course,
Mhm.
we are not black and white beings.
Mhm.
We are gray. We are extremely gray.
We're gray
We are
aliens.
grays. And so we, but the labels do help as far as understanding these interactions, because tough love is very difficult and the conflict is very difficult for the empath. And that's not to say that the conflict, I mean, a personality disorder, they live their life in conflict. They are either trying to, well, I would argue, trying to start a conflict to have power over another, or constantly feeling like they're a victim in a conflict
Mhm.
situation and they're being attacked. And a lot of times, um, personality personality disorders end up having broken relationships, one after the other, whether it is family members that they haven't talked to in 10 years, um, several divorces, everyone in their workplace is against them. And I'm using air quotes for those that are just listening and not watching, because they are highly paranoid, not in the sense that they're having hallucinations or imagining things that aren't there, but in a sense, they are sort of imagining something that's not there, because they see what we would call an everyday reaction. They see that as, I'm being attacked.
Mhm.
And it makes interpersonal relationships extremely challenging. Um, And, you know, the best that can be done for those individuals, well, first of all, it's a difficult diagnosis to make. And we don't necessarily know what creates those personality disorders. Sometimes it does stem from a trauma history. And, you know, we're always looking for the root cause as naturopaths. Um, so if we can heal the trauma, a lot of times that ends up, you know, some sort of therapy. And there's a lots of, you know, lots of different types of therapies. Some of it is talk therapy, some of it is, you know, somatic, experiential. um but that's what ends up being the tools that psychiatrists will use with those individuals. um it's not something you can just take a pill for a lot of times. You can you know, help them to optimize their physical health, but what it really comes down to is, if there's a trauma history, let's work on healing the trauma in however slow that needs to happen, in whatever way it needs to happen. It can look like a lot of different things, but
Mm.
really learning sort of how to deal with interpersonal conflict is a piece of that for those
Mm-hmm.
individuals. So it really stems from this idea of conflict. And then the empath, conflict makes them so uncomfortable because they just feel everything so deeply. They feel at odds on their own side of it, and they feel how uncomfortable that other person is as well. And
Mm.
it sucks to feel that. I mean, sometimes, some days I wish that I didn't care as much, because I was like, oh, well, wouldn't that be nice if I could just go through the day and not be as deeply affected as I am,
Mm.
and just be able to get through the day, you know, because it's like there's so much trauma in our world.
Mm-hmm.
And if we choose to engage in the news and social media and the conversations happening around us, and not be a complete shut-in, and, like, you know, purposely put ourselves in the shadows so that we don't have to face the pain, you know, it's a difficult place to be. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a point here about the intention setting. So somebody might be approaching conflict from a standpoint that they actually want to create conflict. Either they're trying to get back at somebody, or they have some kind of negative emotion that they're trying to discharge on someone, and they're seeking conflict for that sake. Whereas I think the healthy form of conflict is you're actually seeking some good, but conflict is somehow, you know, it's the bridge to get there. So maybe you're having a tough time with a partner, and you just know that it's this thing that's standing in the way, and you know that if you broach it, this is definitely going to lead into conflict, but you're not aiming for the conflict, you're almost aiming past it. um and that, I think that's the healthy way to view conflict. um but a lot of conflict is not like that. A lot of conflict is chaotic, and it doesn't really have any real purpose. And as you say about letting things in, I mean, it's big with the availability of information now and social media and all this information. We are the gatekeepers of our own mental sanity. Like, you can be as messed up as you want to be if you just look at everything wrong, and then that's what you focus on, and it doesn't resolve anything by being aware of it in a lot of cases. Um, so I think it's really helpful, especially for empathetic people, people who tend to feel deeply, to really pick and choose their battles, as you said, with what they're going to focus their mind on, what they're going to let in, how much of it they're going to let in, um, because you can't really help anybody if you yourself are not in a good state. I mean, that's the fundamental healer's dilemma, isn't it? With, you know, the
Mhm.
wounded healer, where interfacing with these really difficult experiences of people can in and of itself be traumatic to you if you don't approach it with a certain kind of like stoicism, in some sense, where you have your own sense of your own self, your own boundaries, and you're coming in, as you said, with that uh, divine love aspect rather than personal.
Mhm.
Also brings up the point of it not being recommended for doctors to treat their family, or even like
Mhm.
surgeons to do surgeries on their family. And it's
Yes.
because that connection is so close, right? That it almost gets
Yes.
in the way of the actual therapeutic thing. Because what if you have to do something that's going to hurt them, but it's ultimately going to lead to the better? It's going to be a little bit harder if you have personal attachment to that person.
Yep. And I want to tell a story as far as, I mean, I've had many of these experiences, but one that stands out that's recent because it happened in the last couple of years, of feeling the the collective consciousness, feeling sort of the feelings of another group rather than your own. So a good example of this for me was whenever it was that President Trump was elected. What was that, 2 years ago? I don't know. I don't even know what day it is.
Yeah, who
However,
knows anymore? It's Groundhog Day.
indeed, indeed. But I remember, and I'm not a big political news person because I'm highly sensitive. It is too overwhelming for me because I often feel powerless, as I'm sure many of us do. We don't know where to start. So I've sort of redirected, instead of feeling guilty about not engaging with the news, I found other ways to help my own version of feeling like I was doing something, and being a
Mhm.
doctor is a big part of that. Um, and so I remember on election night, um, I had not really kept a close eye on what the polls were doing. And I went to bed pretty early that night, like 8:30, 9 p.m. I always turn my phone on airplane mode. So I
That's
turn it,
smart.
yeah, I'm just like not dealing
Honestly,
with it.
keeping my phone on airplane mode even through the day, I mean, you
Oh,
can
yeah.
save yourself so many problems. It's
Ooh,
amazing how it's like Pandora's box. You
yep.
open it up, you go on Instagram, you just look through, and it's just like you look through for a while, and you just feel like your
Just
soul
feel
has been drained from your body,
exactly.
and you're just anxious.
You just feel numb. You feel drained. You're like, I'm anxious and I'm also depressed. I don't know what to think. I feel hopeless. Now I'm just, but you also don't necessarily feel, at least I don't feel more informed. I feel more helpless.
No, it does. Some information doesn't help to know about.
So I turned my phone on airplane mode like I do every night, went to sleep. About midnight or 1 a.m., I wake up in a panic and I don't know why.
Hmm.
My heart is racing. I'm gasping for air. I start pacing around the apartment. I, use the restroom. I try to figure out, well, what time is it? I hear some, sort of commotion outside, people talking or carrying on. I eventually go back to sleep. The next morning, I send a text, and I was a student at the time. I sent a text to one of my friends who's a student, um, and say, in the text, I said, "Who is the president?" And she responds with, "Donald Trump." And I said to myself, that's why I woke up in a panic, because the whole world, many people in our world, in our immediate United States world, were in a panic, because right about the time I woke up was a little bit after those final results had come through.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not here to talk about politics, but I felt the panic of at least the people in my neighborhood, in the city,
Mm-hmm.
and showed up to school the next day and people were crying. They were so upset. They were so freaked out what was going to happen, right? And I felt that, and I knew it was not my own fear. I knew because I was dead asleep, but that woke me up. And um I think we have to, however we can, start to recognize, where does our where does our true feeling or fear or opinion or anxiety or what's going on for us at the time, where does that end? And where does somebody else's suffering come in? Where does that begin? And as much as we can, try to figure out where that line is, because what is the mob mentality? Why is it so scary to, see people rioting? Is only because as soon as something shifts and all of a sudden there's mass chaos,
That shift is happening internally in us
and people
concurrently.
are, and it's a domino effect, it's a wave. As soon as that intense feeling is sparked in one person, it's very easy to affect the feeling of
It's like a
someone else.
virus. It's like a mental
Exactly.
virus that just
even
spreads.
even if that person didn't come into that situation thinking, I'm afraid of this, I'm going to rise up against this, I'm afraid of the virus, I want to, whatever, fill in the blank. I'm going to freak out about this, or this thing on the news happened, I'm going to react in this way. All of a sudden, you start to sort of follow what's happening around you. And it happens in nature where a flock of birds fly away from a storm. And the birds, they follow each other. Like, they are ingrained. It's ingrained in them to follow the herd,
Mm-hmm.
or the flock, or whatever. It's unnatural for one human to not follow a crowd of people one direction and to go the opposite direction. It's very unnatural to do that.
Right.
But I would say the mob mentality, it's a very intense force, and we are dealing with a lot of divided mob mentalities right now, which makes things even more difficult to deal with, because we don't know, a lot of times it's the emotions that are pulling us this way or another, or that way, and we don't know, we can't find our bearings.
Mm.
um
The last 2 months, I think, have been so instrumental in proving the existence of some kind of collective unconscious to me,
mhm,
where it's like, because I have been mostly trying to avoid social media, buying into everything going on as much as possible ever since the whole quarantine thing started, because at first I just jumped right in. I wanted to know everything about COVID. I wanted to know what was happening. I wanted to know when we were reopening. I wanted to know all that. And what did it do? It just got me in a fluster. It got in the way of my daily life. So at one point I kind of decided, okay, I can choose what I focus my mind on. I'm going to focus my mind on what I need to do to, live well, to treat people well that are near me, to have the influence that I possibly can. But the interesting thing that happens with the airplane mode kind of thing is you'll still feel the mass reactions, even if you're not watching them, which is so strange, because after not watching very closely and then being in like a super anxious state, almost like panicky, and not knowing why, and then you look and you see all this stuff happening and you're like, I wasn't even aware that all that was happening, and I was already feeling it, on some deep level. Um, it's really interesting, and even our dreams are affected by it. Like last night I had a dream about this whole situation. I've been mostly just focusing on graduating, because any
mhm.
any sliver of attention that goes, any like extra cortisol burst that comes from any other source, is it's just I'm like teetering on the edge already, just the basic requirements of life. So like anything coming in, I'm just like, nope, that's going to destroy me.
Yes.
um but it's still, going into my mind, still something that I think about. I can't help but to think about it.
Mhm.
Um, but I actually had a dream, which I think was pretty healing last night, where I think I found what my kind of place in it is.
Mm.
Um, and in the dream, I saw like a group of like protesters walking by, and I was sitting on a hill, like sitting in a grassy hill, kind of in almost like a meditative posture. And I was just sitting there watching them with kind of gratitude, love, and support, and just like clapping. That's what the whole dream was, is
Mhm.
me just like watching people doing uh this, which I saw as actually very like beneficial and something deep, something true
Mhm.
was happening.
Mhm.
But that I was there in a, you know, kind of supportive role from my own place. And I've always been like that, you know, studying philosophy and everything. So I always like whatever is the mass view on anything. I'm almost always like the opposite view by nature. Um, but
Hmm.
it's interesting. You can't get away from those human conflicts because they're happening within us. And I bet even if you were living in some cave somewhere, you'd still have weird dreams that were that you could probably link together. Well, this and that is happening. In fact, I actually think I had a dream about all this COVID stuff a while ago.
Wow.
Really weird one. So let me share it.
Okay.
It's probably had. Okay, anyway, so the dream happened about 2 years ago, and it was a very particularly strange one because there was a lot of symbolism that I didn't understand until later. So in the dream, there's some kind of like weird, chaotic pandemic going on. And I go up to this house. There's this party, some kind of house party there that I'm trying to enter into. At the door, there's a person, and there's also like a half dog, half human, uh, who is basically there to sniff people's like wrists to see if they have influenza. That's literally what the dream was. And um, in the dream, you weren't allowed into the party unless you were cleared for influenza, which was really weird because it had nothing to do with anything at the time. This was a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But it really stuck in my mind for a few reasons. There was a lot of like healing elements later in the dream where I went into some temple like underwater and I was searching for my healing, and then learning about the myths of Asclepius and those kind of groups. So he's often represented uh, as having like a dog companion, like the dog is symbolic, which is really weird because after that dream, when I saw dogs, I started seeing their face. Like I started because in the dream it was like a half human, half dog. It was really weird, hard to explain. But after that, I saw dogs and I actually saw that they had a face and a personality, like they were like people, kind of. Um, but anyway, all that to say that, you know, then all this starts happening, and then that dream instantly comes back up, and I'm like, oh wow, like is this like one of those premonition dreams that happens a few years before big, kind of cataclysmic things? Um, it's pretty well reported before big wars and things. People have all sorts of weird dreams in the months and years leading up.
Well, I was noticing sort of end of days types of
Mm.
dreams for, and it might have been kind of around when all of this started, or, but the timeline is becoming so blurry that it's hard to know. But I'm not typically a person that has um, like
Doomsday
bad
dreams.
doomsday dreams for nights and nights on end. Like, sure, they'll happen here and there in life, but it was happening all of the time, like just very intense sort of end of days. And it brings up for me and everything that's kind of coming to a head. There's so much right now that it feels like we've been in a pressure cooker for a long time and we didn't notice it at first. It's kind of like when you put lobsters into the warm water and they're like, okay, everything's fine. And then at a certain point, they're being boiled. And it, you know, that is literally what's happening is you don't notice that the water temperature is slowly increasing if you've been in the bath that entire time. But the fact is, there's been so much toxic shit that has been going on for a lot longer than we've been alive, that so much of it now is coming to a head. And it's a very volatile and tumultuous time. And some would say 2020 is the worst year ever, right? But like, if we're able to change and make significant change in some huge areas of our society that need to change, if this is if shit literally needs to burn down before it can be rebuilt, I mean, would you I don't know many people that would want to go back to the way things were, where, you know, and that's not to say that we are out of that yet, but we are in a process of change.
Hmm.
I don't know where that leaves us, but I think that in general, in order for us to raise our own vibration as human beings, as a collective, we need to take out the trash. And
Right.
so that means something different for all of us. We all have toxic shit in our lives, in our individual lives, that is trash, and we need to take out the trash. And sometimes that means, you know, a lot of us, I think, are finding out who our true friends are and who is not
Mm.
right now. Just in our reactions and responses to the things that are going on around us. It's a very polarizing time. It's also a time where, on the one hand, being neutral might serve us, but as far as the racist conversation, as far as I'm concerned, there is no neutral that is not part of the oppressor.
Mm.
That doesn't mean that, as far as the virus is concerned, that we can't have some neutrality and see what's happening around us. But I don't believe that you can be neutral and not be racist. You must be anti-racist
Mm.
or racist. And I believe we all have work to do in that regard, in examining our own biases, our own behaviors, and maybe ways that we've stayed silent that was actually doing more harm than good.
Mm.
And so I think it's just time we take out the trash, and maybe our dreams are part of that detoxing process. But coming back to being intentional, um, I think it's like we're in a time right now where people are so easily triggered just by using a certain word in a sentence a certain way. I mean, it's like we've started to scrutinize each other that with that level of detail,
Hmm.
that we must be so intentional about what we say, especially if we were to go posting something on social media. Or I mean, even recording this conversation, I'm wondering how many people are going to think I'm discriminating against people with personality disorders, right? But that's not my intention.
Yeah.
It's not my intention at all. So I
Right.
hope I'm not misunderstood, but there
Well,
will be people that misunderstand
and that's
my
part of the
intention.
thing is you can't really control that. Like all
Right.
you can control is your own intent, taking out your trash,
Mm-hmm.
living your life, being good, expressing that. And people will misinterpret as they will. And there's really nothing that can be done about it, because then it gets into that kind of dynamic of the going back to like the empath and the narcissist, where the empath will kind of walk on eggshells always and never actually be themselves because they're afraid of being themselves in a way that to a normal person wouldn't cause a reaction. But to a person who's deeply troubled, even normal things are taken as an offense. So I've known people like that, and it's really hard to separate yourself from that, because unless you have like some group of people to talk to and be like, hey, this and that happened, is that normal? And they're like, that's not normal, like that's not a normal response. What they said to what you said was not a normal response. Like you shouldn't feel bad about what you said. You Any typical person would have not taken offense at that. But you kind of especially when you're in a close relationship with a person like that, you start taking on those kind of things, and you think, you know, everything that I do that triggers them is something that I'm doing that's wrong, which is
Well,
not
that's
necessarily the case.
the classic abusive relationship, isn't it?
Mm.
Think of the stereotypical husband either verbally or physically abusing the wife.
Hmm.
Let's say a narcissistic husband, and I'm of course using stereotypes here. Of course, women can also abuse men, uh, whatever. But whoever the victim is here, we'll say it's the wife who's being abused. She's convinced that she is in the wrong, which is why she stays. Or she's terrified of what she might lose if she leaves. And the classic narcissistic abuser husband um, makes her think that she can't have it any better if she were to leave, makes her think that she's lesser than. Um, and that narcissistic husband is so charming to all of her friends and all of her family members. There's no way. And in fact, those personalities
Mm,
often put people against each other who should be on the same side.
mm.
So when you
They spread
start to,
insidious rumors and things like that, and then
yep.
even your friends are like, well, maybe you're in the wrong. But that's all
And
that manipulation.
manipulation is exactly it. And that is the intention, is manipulation. How can the narcissist make themselves look better? Often it means making others look worse. It means weakening others. How can you weaken someone else? Make them think that they need you, that they cannot be independent.
Mm,
And again, using labels, making it very black and white to illustrate a point. It
mm.
is not always that black and white in our interactions. It often is, however, that black and white.
Right.
And
And
um,
that's part of the danger of getting yourself out of one of those relationships, because that person that's labeled the energy vampire or the narcissist, that's just like a part of them.
mhm,
It's not all they are. That's not all. They have loving qualities. They have great qualities. They have this and that. And then they also have this.
mhm.
So it's really easy to stay tangled up in that, because especially if you come from an empathetic kind of viewpoint, to see the good in
especially
others and not.
especially because a narcissistic personality, if we're talking about textbook definitions,
Mm,
a psychopathic personality, they are often the most charming people you will ever meet.
that's so scary.
That is why, I mean, if they were acting, abusive and violent
And no one would
and
like them, and then
and
they wouldn't have
ugly,
that sway.
why would anybody be caught in their net? It doesn't
Mm,
work like that. It is extremely manipulative. Um, and us empaths, or at least from my perspective, you see the charm in that person and you want so badly for that to be who they always are in their entirety. The empath wants to see everybody reach their fullest potential. They see one little thing in somebody that is good, the charming personality, their first impression was this: oh, they were so charismatic, they were so funny, they were such a gentleman, until you try to do this thing and they lashed out, or they got jealous because you wanted to do this thing. It is an extremely manipulative, often subtle to an outsider. And
mhm,
that is how sometimes friends and family members can be pulled apart, because they say, oh, well, why are you trying to leave this person?
mm.
He's an absolute gentleman. And they aren't seeing sort of that underlying manipulation. But what you said is important also earlier, which is that you have to have people you do trust that you can use as a sounding board in these types of situations, especially if you cannot distinguish what's right and wrong here. Like,
Mhm.
is it really you and your own shit that you have to deal with and grow, and it's an opportunity for your own growth, and that's why the conflict is happening? Or is it because you're in this toxic relationship and you
Mm.
are seeing this as your fault, when in fact it's the personality disorder
Right.
that is causing you to feel this way?
Right. And that's kind of the role of the counselor, the wise counsel. It's
Mm-hmm.
almost impossible to see that, because there's always mixed elements. Because
Mm-hmm.
even in that case that I was referring to, where I was caught in this kind of pattern, I was also playing into it, and I was also doing things that were bad as well. But like, to get that nuanced of a view is really difficult, because usually it's all them or it's all me, and like you kind of vacillate between the two things. But it's usually just, as you were saying, this kind of gray. So having an outside view is so important, because when you're in the pattern, you can't really see the pattern at all.
And on the other hand of that, you know, the family members and the friends thinking that the partner or the narcissistic husband or wife or partner is in the right, a lot of times it can go the other way, where your friends and family are saying to you, there's something up with that person. I don't think you're safe. You need to get out. And you may not have made it full circle. You might still be trying to, as the empath, you might still be trying to wait, but if only he would reach his potential,
Mm.
then it would be fine. And you want that so bad. You want that for all of humanity. That is like the ultimate goal, is for each and every one of us to reach our highest potential. However, we will not all reach our potential. And that version of the story often puts family members against each other because, you know, the sister, the cousin, the mother said to her daughter, you need to leave him. And she said, I can't. All of a sudden, the sister and the mother and the cousin, they want nothing to do with this wife of a narcissist anymore. She won't leave him, right? And that creates, so there's no way to actually avoid conflict. You're kind of redirecting the conflict
Mm.
by trying to avoid or walk on eggshells around these difficult conversations, or you know, being afraid to put up boundaries. You end up causing conflict in some way. It may
Mm.
not be directly with that person.
Well, that's the thing. You might temporarily stop the external conflict, but what do you get? You get an internal conflict.
Oh yeah, big
That's the
time.
trade-off.
Oh, big time.
It's either going to happen externally or it's going to happen inside of you, and you're not going to even know why it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Yep.
also a this kind of insight I've had and also read. I wanted to hear what you thought about it. That fundamentally, psychologically speaking, there's two main energies: love and power. And
Mm.
if you don't have one, you want the other. So people who don't have a sense of love, they don't have a sense of love from others, for themselves, they seek power over people. And
Mm-hmm.
power means manipulation, controlling,
Yep.
etc.
Yep.
And vice versa. People who have love don't really seek power over people. They just seek. So there's dualities of being a human being. And it seems to, it helps in viewing somebody who is manipulative
Mm-hmm.
as not like bad or evil, but actually what they really are, which is sick and wanting of love, because that's really what it is. It's no one who is very manipulative is ever a happy person. I mean, they might seem happy, but that's their, you know, their charm,
Mm-hmm.
which is an illusion, which is another form of power and manipulation over people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would agree that, to me, that makes sense, that if you have love and you feel loved, um, then that should be all that there is. What else is there beyond that? You don't feel the need to have power or to overpower another if you have what you need, because seeking power means that you've been denied something,
Mm-hmm.
or at least the perception that you've been denied something.
Right.
Um, and you know, the theory behind why does one person rape another person, it's not, it has much less to do with being sexually turned on. It's to overpower that person, it's to shame that person, it's maybe even to manipulate
Mm-hmm.
that person, whether or not they knew them, whether or not they really even premeditated it. It's a power seeking.
Mm-hmm.
And it is more about the damage in that own, in the perpetrator.
Mm.
It's a lot less about their victim most of the time,
Yeah,
statistically.
that's a really good point. Yeah, it's like when you're in a kind of chaotic environment where you don't have that feeling of love, the biological imperative is to seek control of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And then that can become pathological, where it's somebody feels that they're so low, they feel maybe so rejected that they'll actually, that's their way of getting back. Actually, it's a really interesting that you bring the conversation there, because if you look at pretty much every famous serial killer, they all had serious issues with women, their mothers, etc., and most of their targets were women. And I think that that's the reason why, to some
Mm-hmm.
degree, they had some kind of like deep resentment from something that happened, either real or imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Right.
to get that like sense of feeling like they're okay or worthy of love, they took actions that gave them not love but at least power. So
Mm-hmm.
that was some satisfaction for
Yep.
them.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, it's an interesting world we live in, isn't it?
Yeah, well, 2020 is the year of the shadow. For I'm calling it here. It's the year of the
Mm-hmm.
shadow.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's accurate. I think we would all agree with that. There is some dark shit coming up, but you know what? It's been around. We have been living amongst it. We have, in many cases, maybe not wanted to face it. Um,
Well, now we're
it,
being forced to face it,
but
which is way more painful than
we have
choosing to
no
face it.
choice. Yeah, we have no choice now. And but what we do have a choice in is how do we intentionally pick and choose what gets to stay and what gets taken out with the trash.
Mm,
Because it is a time that we can, I mean, what a great time to make those changes. The momentum is already happening. Um, Many of us are spending a lot more time at home with our own thoughts, for better or worse. And it is an opportunity to make some radical change
mm,
for each of us as individuals.
mm,
And sort of starting, I would hope, with a clean slate in a lot of regards,
mm.
you know.
Something I've been thinking about lately, in terms of whenever I catch myself complaining about something, is doing this thought experiment of figuring out, how am I at fault for this? And you can
Mm,
always find how you're at fault
mm,
for something that happened or some circumstance. And although that seems that that would make you feel bad, it actually makes you feel really good, because you realize, if I was the reason that this or that happened in my life that's bad, that means that I could make the good thing happen also, just as it's just another choice. So that's been really helpful in like not not even blaming the external environment for my own internal feelings, because at the end of the day, like, what's happening externally, it's triggering internal, but the internals, that's my stuff to work with. That's not any, like, to say that this and that happened because I'm feeling this way because this and that, like, that's only part of the story.
mhm.
Really, there's something there, there's some wounding that's still, felt by difficult circumstances or something like that.
And I think that, that brings up this idea that when we're complaining, obviously there's an element of suffering
Mm.
there, or
Mhm.
discord that we feel. If something is not ideal and it's causing us to complain, whether or not it's just because we're not practicing gratitude or we don't see our own sort of responsibility in the situation, but there is a level of dissatisfaction. And I think in the the power in that is we can turn it into, rather than complaining, what is it that we are curious about? Because people who are curious are propelling themselves forward
Mm.
toward something. You are seeking something out, versus complaining feels a little bit more like I'm digging my heels in. You don't necessarily have a solution in mind. You're just saying, these things are happening and I don't like this. And it's sort of like you're taking like a stubborn stance on things. Now, if you're solution oriented, or you're like, I wonder what would happen if I tried this instead. Like, how would that change certain circumstances? Okay, clearly I'm dissatisfied. However, I wonder how things could be different if I tried this. And it doesn't necessarily always have to be like an action step that we go, change something physically, but rather what we were talking about before, which is that you can choose what you focus on in your mind, or you can reframe what you were thinking about as being the complaint or being the struggle or being the negative thing. Just as I would argue, as even though a lot of shit has happened in 2020, I would argue that this is the time that we take the trash out. What better time? This is our opportunity. Everyone's on board. Everyone's going through some shit right now.
It's factual.
No matter what side you are on of anything, right? You are going through something. You're pissed about something, more than likely. Even if you're the most zen, peaceful person, something has got you, got you going about something.
I was talking to my friend about this, and we were kind of talking about how a lot of our plans got derailed. And what came to my mind as we were talking about this is like, everyone's plans got derailed because everyone's always planning. So if things get derailed, then everyone's things get derailed. Unless they're just not doing anything. And then their plans aren't derailed.
Yeah. And then they're like, just going back to meditating in the cave.
Right. Because everyone can make a good argument why this circumstance, the quarantine, everything that's happening, this is so bad, especially for me. I'm the victim, etc. Which is fundamentally it's such an insidious viewpoint, because you don't really realize how harmful it is to even let like a thought of that pass, because that mindset of complaining about a situation, if we look at it clearly, we see that actually the complaining just perpetuates it. Not only because we're convincing ourselves that that's the reality and that's what it is, but it comes from this root of, not only are things bad the way they are, but I have no say in it. That's what complaining is, like discharging your energy that could be used in figuring out, how you could deal with something. There's this thought experiment that I've been thinking about, where whenever you're really having a hard time, you just imagine, what would this look like if it was easy? Like, what would the easy version of this look like? And often, like, it's right there. And it's just when you stop like resisting, it's like, oh, the easy version is I just do the thing. Okay, simple. Like, the hard version is, complex, and it has all sorts of weird, ways around it. But
it reminds me of what we were talking about offline in part 1. So we had a lengthy conversation.
The secret episode.
The multiverse on offline. Tune in via ESP. A conversation where I was backpacking in Nepal, and I was very physically uncomfortable, and I was pissed because I couldn't take a shower because we were in the mountains. We were, going from shack to shack. And a lot of times there wasn't hot water, or there wasn't a shower at all. And days went by where I wasn't able to shower. And I was pissed because I was a spoiled American who's never been without hot running water and a bed, unless I chose to go out into the wilderness like I did this time. I mean, it was my choice to do it. And yet here I was complaining like a spoiled American. And eventually I decided at some point, and maybe it was because my complaining mind got tired and said, well, okay, I guess I'll just surrender to this. What's the worst that could happen? Right? nothing. You smell worse.
Yeah.
That is it.
You're in the same spot as you were before, except now you're just not in mental anguish. It's
And
the only difference.
everything in my environment and what I was seeing out in the world and the people I was interacting with, and like, you know, the spiritual experience, like all of that remained the same. The only difference was I got a shower or I didn't. And I decided that I was going to be fine with not getting a shower until the next time I got one, which who knows when that would have been. It either
Mm,
was when the trek ended or it was going to be somewhere along the trek.
yeah. And that's
And
the interesting thing is like
yeah,
the suffering wasn't necessarily caused by, you know, the lack of a shower. It was caused by your ideas of showering
yep,
or how it
yep.
should be or how things should be different than they are. I mean, you can sum up all human suffering as these are the ways that things should be different than they are.
Hmm.
Insert like whatever
Yes,
explanation.
yes. And not only like, even if things are great, like even if you just accomplished something that you'd been working toward for, you know, weeks, months, years, you get to that final accomplishment and it's done and you're on the other side of it. And for some of us, it's like the first thing in your head is, oh, well, I could have done this differently. Or
Mm.
now I have to worry about fill in
Yeah,
the
what's
blank.
next?
What's next? You don't even, you know, someone compliments you on your accomplishment and you don't even
Acknowledge it.
acknowledge it. You brush
Yeah.
it off. Like, you're like, well, you know, whatever. And then you're picking it apart, all the things you could have done better. And it's like, I just remember when I finally got to take that shower in Nepal and I was washing my hair, and it was the most blissful experience ever. And I was like, wow, talk about a perspective change. All of a sudden, this showering became on the pedestal of my life goal, you know, as I knew it. And like, how blessed was I that I got a hot shower and was able to wash my hair for the first time in whatever it was, 2 weeks. And it was such a blissful experience that that was the perspective shift. It's like, look around, see how poor these people are living amongst you, and yet they are so happy, they are so friendly, um, they live their life through a very different lens, looking through a very different lens with very different perspectives on what suffering is. And you know, for a lot of those people living in Nepal, they didn't know anything other than sometimes you get a hot shower if the sun was out that day, other days you don't.
And
They
that's
didn't
partially how
know.
we're poisoned by the media and social media and all that, because by definition, it's always everything you see, the mind automatically compares yourself to it. But that's a very dangerous path because if you follow that path, you'll just become not only like everyone else, but you'll actually become just like what others project, which isn't even necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of lose your own you lose your own way. Ultimately, I think just comparing yourself with yourself of yesterday is like the most mentally healthy way to live because we're all
Well,
so different.
before I went to Nepal, I never thought that I would want to like sit in a room with someone else and listen to their problems. That was not my goal. And then something shifted in me in
Hmm.
Nepal, and it was like, you know, it was physically taxing. It was, you know, outside of my comfort zone as far as the amenities I was used to. And it was a spiritual experience. And something about being there made me realize it's time to dedicate my life to serving other people. It's not enough to just be serving myself. Sure, there's the aspect of physician, heal thyself, heal yourself so that you can heal someone else.
Hmm.
Um, it's not heal yourself because you're the only one that matters. That's not what it's for.
Right.
So that trip was pivotal for me. And I think that, I think back a lot to that trip, especially in the times that we are now, where we're divided. We are, we need to count our blessings. We need to kind of force ourselves however we can. I mean, obviously travel is not that possible easily right now, but I would say for those people that are living in their own bubble, as far as believing that things should be a certain way, not understanding what it's like for another individual, what someone else might be going through, what their suffering looks like. Travel to another country. Travel, if you've never left the state that you live in, go to another state. When we are allowed to travel easily again, go somewhere else that's not where you are from, and you will quickly realize that life is very different from the little bubble where you grew up. I mean, it's so important for us to go out and experience the world, because then we realize how narrow our
Mm.
view is. And it doesn't necessarily take going to another country to
You
figure
could
that
just
out.
read a book of somebody
You
from the
could,
1800s who
you
was,
could,
a
yes,
philosopher of life and see
you
a whole
could
different view of the
read,
world.
you could read a history book. You could read, yeah, I mean, you could go to the other side of the city, right? You could go to a different neighborhood, see how things are different. I mean, we just, we like our comfort zones. We gotta break it down sometimes,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah, that's the default mode, seeking for comfort,
Hmm.
good feeling. It makes sense. I mean, good feeling feels good. And if you could have
Yeah,
more of it,
it's
why wouldn't you want more? But it
right.
never works like that, because it's like the shower thing where like showers are good, they feel good, right? Okay, have 5 showers a day. And like you don't appreciate any of them. So like, are they good? Or maybe they're good when you have them every once in a while, or maybe they're good after a nice workout, because now it's like there's a reason for it, not just because you shower compulsively 5 times a day.
Oh my goodness.
But everything's like that um, shower thing. It's interesting too, because at least we're incredibly in a good place, like in the United States and most parts of the United States, where most of our needs are met. And like the question now is like, how do you live like a fulfilled life in spite of all these this or that difficulty? It's not, for many people, it's not a question of like where are they going to get their next loaf of bread from, although there are people like that, and I'm sure now it's even more than it was before.
Hmm.
um but it's like when you take away the fundamental difficulties of being a human, you get all sorts of fake difficulties,
Hmm.
like thought, like being in your head, and like thoughts like what is the life that I'm meant for, and all of this. And
Hmm.
sometimes I tend to be like that too, like thinking of like the greater meaning of my life. But sometimes I have to take almost a Zen view of it, where it's just live your life, just be there. If you're walking,
Hmm.
walk. If you're sleeping, sleep. If you're eating, eat. Not everything has to have some thought to go along with it. Like that life is what happens in between thoughts, probably, because thoughts are very distracting.
Thoughts are very pervasive, and especially when we allow our own thoughts and opinions, we need them to be informed by something that is external.
Mm. Yeah, my man Socrates, he said, "The life unexamined is not worth living."
Yeah,
And that, I think that
exactly.
means examining your own thoughts, and not just like when you catch like a complaint or anything that just makes you feel bad, to question like, what's the purpose of it? Is this something that I'm going to accept, agree with? And most of the time it's just like this tape recorder that's just on a broken loop, and no one knows who started it, but it's
Hmm.
just going, and it's you know not in accord with reality. You finally achieve something, and then it tells you not good enough, or you don't achieve something and it says, oh, you're so bad that you didn't do it. It's like you never win. With the problem isn't like what we do, it's our mind in what we do. because
Mhm.
that will define. You can have, millions of dollars and be held to be the most successful person in the world and enlightened by everybody. Um, but you might not even enjoy your life. I mean, that happens to a lot of people. So that's priorities. I think this time is showing us priorities. What are the
Oh yeah.
priorities?
Oh yeah. So I want to make sure I talk one more time a little bit about like the boundary setting
Yeah,
and
right.
what that can look like.
Yeah, what does that look like? Because I hear that a lot. That
Mhm.
oh, I need to set boundaries, and it seems a little bit like a very abstract notion of what's
Yeah,
actually being
and
referred to.
certainly like there are probably a lot of ways to do it, and so I'll share some ways that have worked for me, and a few different versions of what it looks like, because I think people just resonate with different practices.
Hmm.
And one thing that we talked about in part one of our conversation was, and it was actually in the context of how to strengthen your intuition.
Mm.
But I think that part of this is all sort of connected in a sense, because a lot of our boundary comes from our connection with the earth. Like that is really our core energy source. So when we feel drained when we're going about the day, it may be because we've been spending most of the time in our heads, either worrying about something or, thinking about something, working through a problem, or looking for some sort of external stimulus as far as, news and being connected to the collective unconscious.
Hmm.
And those are ways that our energy gets drained. But ways that we can become energized is something that I mentioned before in the other episode, which was um, either barefoot walking or different grounding exercises.
Mm.
If you have the ability to go walk without shoes on and get your feet actually in dirt, or like walk in the sand, like along the beach, that in and of
Mm.
itself,
That sounds nice.
I mean, just like you could like go there now in your mind
I
and
can
just,
feel
I
that
mean,
sand between my
my
toes.
body, yeah, and my body just like, I know that when I'm walking barefoot on the beach, something about the sand and the way you kind of have to balance a little bit, you have to grip a little bit with your feet, and you're getting the negative ions from the ocean and the waves, and you're getting like that ocean air, but my body will just kind of adjust itself just doing that. And I mean physically, like sometimes I'll get, aches and pains in, my back, and then I'll walk on the beach and all of a sudden it'll just sort of set itself right. So, that's very particular to having access to the coast, which is amazing if you have that.
Yeah, that's why
But
Oregon is the greatest state of all time.
yes, the
We
coast
got the
is not
coast over
far
here. We
away.
got the mountains over here.
Yep.
It's awesome.
So, but
Forest.
you don't have to be at the ocean. You can, if you have to just go right outside your house, your apartment, walk around. If you don't have that easy access, honestly, something that a doctor told me once when I was feeling anxious was get a bucket of dirt, put your feet in it, get a few pebbles that you can mix in there and feel them with your feet.
That
Like
sounds pretty
you literally,
sad.
it is sad, but like think about people in New York City who
Right.
are, they're, I mean, who knows when the last time they left their
I
high-rise apartment. I
can't even
mean,
imagine being on the 30th floor and everything's quarantined. It's like,
whew,
how do you even live?
talk about stress. Oh my gosh, I would be an anxious mess. And I'm sure that a lot of people over there are right now. If they're not,
Mhm.
if that's not part of their normal everyday life, I'm sure they're more anxious now. Hopefully they have some way to get outside. Um, and then the other thing is, um, honestly, a practice that when I went to massage school and my massage teacher was talking to us about boundaries, um, and she said, and this was, in between doing body work with people, but she said, wash your hands in cold water and wash your wrists off. And I don't know what it is about the wrists, but it's some exchange of energy that happens there from an energetic standpoint. So sometimes wash your hands in cold water, even if you don't actually have to wash your hands. I mean, now we're washing our hands all the time, so that's an easy thing to do, but just Cold water is good because it just kind of, gets your circulation going. And then sometimes it's like if you're going into a patient room or you're switching from one patient room to another and you need to just ground yourself, like just stop, take a few deep breaths, feel your feet, like focus on your feet. Or before you're going in for an interview or a difficult conversation, or, you have a public speaking engagement or something that you would feel nervous about. Take a few deep breaths, close your eyes if that feels comfortable to you, get grounded in your body. And, deep breathing or 4-square breathing, where you're inhaling for 4 seconds, holding the breath for 4 seconds, exhaling for 4, and then holding for 4. That's 4-square breathing. That's a way to get into the parasympathetic system of the body, but also be able to feel your body physically. And you can imagine a protective color around you. Just imagine that. And if it's difficult to imagine, just practice it anyway. Just pretend that you can see it. Just think about, like, if I were watching a movie right now, if I closed my eyes and I pretended I was watching a movie and someone had a protective halo around them, and
What's your color right now? Mine is like a green, like emerald.
Oh, nice.
I just felt when you said that, I just kind of saw it almost behind me.
Oh, nice. I would say mine changes, but lately it's been kind of like a pale lavender-ish color. But it's certainly been green and yellow for me as well. And it can change. I'm actually gonna do something very unprofessional and walk downstairs to my charger to disrupt this. But yeah, so
we'll be back after a short intermission. So
here we are, like I never left. But yeah, I think that actually picturing a halo, a protective color around you.
It's a full return, because this is where we filmed part 1. So everything,
we've gone full circle.
The loop is being closed on this episode series.
Yes, indeed. But yes, imagining a protective light, or that you're bathing yourself in, it could be white light, it could be whatever color feels good to you. And I would say practice, if that resonates with you, practice that before you go into a situation where you feel like you need a little bit more protection, for lack of a better word. So practice it when you're in a safe space and see if you can even feel that. And I think that practice, it's good for boundary setting, but it's also could be a powerful practice for people that don't feel like they're not as in tune with, or they don't feel like they're intuitive, or they have difficulty being able to perceive something in their mind's eye. I think just practicing, imagining like a ball of light that you can move around your space. So that's sort of like from an energetic standpoint. And then honestly, sometimes it's like rehearsing certain phrases. If you think that you're going to be in a situation where, like, you're going to go talk to somebody and that person is going to try to manipulate their way some way with you, and you're going to have to tell that person no, in a certain sense.
You almost have to prepare yourself and be ready for, like, they're about to do their shit again, so I got to come in there with like some ways to respond before it catches me off guard.
And honestly, you will start to predict it, because it honestly is a predictable behavior. Once you start to recognize the pattern, it becomes predictable. And so at that point, it should no longer frighten you. It should feel less intimidating, because you're prepared. Right. You can expect it from that individual or someone that you will eventually meet in your life. And you have your your couple responses, you've got them rehearsed, you've got them in your back pocket for when you need it. It's just like saying, if there's something that a patient asks for, you say, well, unfortunately our clinic protocol is blank. We don't prescribe medications on the first visit. Whatever it is, you can make your rule whatever you need it to be. Whether or not it's actually a clinical rule, it doesn't matter. It's your boundary. It's something that it's the way you practice, and you are allowed, within reason, depending on what kind of space you're working in, you are allowed to set your own boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
But for an individual that is trying to manipulate the situation and say, well, why can't you just do this? Like, it'll be fine. Or, really trying to get their way when it's clear that you don't want to, but you haven't fully laid down the boundary, is to just say, instead of saying no, just say, I simply can't, or it's just not possible. And don't apologize, and don't say, well, maybe, because you're leaving the door open, right? Any crack of the door that you leave, the boundary's not there. If you're saying, well, I don't know, I feel like that, no, you have to stand firm in your power, but not power in a negative sense, right? Like empowered. And knowing that in doing that, you are doing right by that other person, even if it doesn't feel like that to them, because that relationship is immediately more therapeutic, because you are not enabling that behavior in them, and you're not letting them put you in a compromising position.
It's so tough for people that tend to be more agreeable in terms of personality traits, which tend to be the people who are empathetic, easy to get along with.
Yes,
Me too.
hello.
Hi everyone.
Hello.
I tend to be easygoing, have a hard time saying no, because no is always, it's potentially leads to conflict, right? Because what does no mean? No means no, right? And then if the person continues anyway, then now there's the threat of like further conflict, because no always implies something. Like, no isn't just no. If someone's like insulting you and you say, no, I'm not taking this, if they keep insulting you, you have to almost progress the no in some sense. So it's always a preliminary to some kind of further conflict. And I think that's what most people are afraid of, that when you say no, the other person will get upset, and then that'll cause issues. But that's also an indicator of maybe you just shouldn't have that person in your life.
Or
like if
maybe
when you say no, they flip out every time. It's like, is that healthy?
And what I think that it is for me is, and I actually notice how much happier I am, ironically, or, you wouldn't think that I would be happier feeling like I have better boundaries, but I'm much happier because it feels safer. Like, we don't want to just be floating out in the ethers. That's why this quarantine time and everything that's being stirred up right now is so uncomfortable for people, is that we don't know where the boundary of this is. We don't know when this will end. We can't plan. We can't make our boundary. We want to build a house and reside in it. And it's very difficult when we can't figure out the boundary of something, because then we are literally floating out in the ether. So it makes me feel more myself when I am able to establish my boundary. And it's going to take, certainly new experiences present themselves, new conflicts present themselves, new opportunities present themselves to establish different flavors of your boundary, because this is all a trial and error situation. I had to figure out in romantic relationships what that looked like with a personality disorder, and now I know exactly what to look for. It doesn't necessarily mean that I won't be manipulated again, right? We want to see the best in people. We don't want to have conflict. We also don't want to be loners, so we don't want to completely cut off human connection either. And I used to be much more of a yes person, with patience, with agreeing to do a certain amount of work, with relationships. I would compromise myself to try to give someone else what they needed and think that it was going to benefit me, and it never did. It almost never benefited me. And I ended up feeling exhausted and or resentful, and or the conflict eventually came anyway.
Mm,
Or I went through the experience, and then looking back on it, I was like, why did I even put myself through that? But I had
mm.
to figure out what damage it did. And um
When you don't say no when it's needed, a lot of times resentment gets projected on that other person,
yeah, oh totally.
which is so interesting how that is.
Yeah, and I mean, I luckily in my clinical experience in school when I was a student, I had some great physician mentors who had such great boundaries, and I would say most of the time that did not alienate the patient. Where sure, there were some situations where it was very clear that the patient shouldn't have been there to begin with. Um, because they had malintent by seeking care of a certain type. But in most situations, it was like the therapeutic relationship continued with the patient. And, a lot of times the physician was very clearly practicing horrible boundaries with the patient, and the students had to sort of deal with that. That's unfortunate, but it made me realize, oh, this is exactly the opposite of what I will do when I am the one calling the shots.
Mm,
And just even though it felt harsh in the moment, you have to establish your own boundaries. And even if you kept a little journal of like, okay, I learned a new boundary today in these circumstances, this is sort of a default response that I can use if I feel like I'm at a loss for words. And I honestly think we have to sort of be making lists of these,
yeah.
because when we are faced with conflict, and especially when it comes out of left field and we are not anticipating it, we get flustered, we don't know what to say, we freeze, and then something ends up happening, and it happens how it happens, and it's probably not the version you were hoping for. And then you're like, oh, shit, how did I let this happen? And then you were thinking through all the things you should have said. But write a list to yourself and just keep
Mm,
coming back to it, and adding to it and refining it, and practicing in other situations and saying, okay, I
mhm.
applied this in that situation and it worked great, or that didn't work at all, I need to think of a new game plan. But
Mhm.
there's a lot of different ways it can look. So obviously those are my own examples of sort of what I figured out up until this point, but it is by no means over. This is a lifetime.
It's just beginning every day.
This is literally just, and I mean, the thing is, some days you just wake up and you're like, I feel more vulnerable. I feel more prone to being upset. Or you're like, I feel nothing. I feel so drained. I feel so apathetic. It doesn't matter what patients will say. I definitely have those days too. So you sort of go back and forth. And I don't want to be either one. I don't want to be walking in completely vulnerable in the sense that the patient's going to walk all over me. I also don't want to be so cut off that I have compassion fatigue, which
Mhm.
occurs when physicians, for one reason or another, are burned out. And it doesn't matter what suffering your patient's going through, you're
Mm,
sort of existing. You're not having a therapeutic relationship. You're not in a healing space. You are too burned out to care. That is not any good either.
mm.
And
I,
so finding that balance.
mm. I think also to have boundaries with ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? To have boundaries with your own mind. Like, these are the kind of thoughts that I will tolerate without questioning. And these are the kind of
Mm-hmm.
thoughts that if I notice it, I just know that it's not helpful. So I won't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
our own thought streams are what really knocks us off our path, probably more often than even other people, because it's like what we think of ourselves afterwards. So setting those boundaries on your own mind, like one example is a boundary against complaining. Like the second
Mm-hmm.
my mind goes to complaining, it's almost like you got to train yourself to recognize it, almost like a physician. You recognize the illness right away the second it comes up, so that you don't, you know, fall into it, because
Mm-hmm.
it all progresses. You know, one, oh, today's gonna suck, leads to, oh, I got to do this and this is difficult, and then that just spirals into, at the end of the day, you're just like in misery. And it didn't have to be like that, and it never does.
Mm-hmm.
But with the boundaries, as with all things, you know, little baby steps, right?
Yeah, and I think that one thing that I had to sort of come to terms with, as far as like talking about being a highly sensitive person, being an empath, making peace with that, because there was a time in my life for years and years I kept getting sick. And looking back, I think that it was a pivotal time in my life where I was growing up. Like, I was no longer a teenager. I was like, okay, it's time to grow up, right? Like, sure, you had your fun in high school, whatever. It's time to like grow up and do what you came here to do. But I went through these years where I was like chronically ill. And I remember being angry that, comparing myself to what, one of my friends, like, well, my friends don't get sick. My friends don't need to do this in order to feel normal. They don't need to do this, this, this. And I remember having a conversation with my mom about this, because I was just so mad. I was so mad that I felt like, I'm so sensitive. I get sick if I do this thing. And it took a lot to get me that sick. Like, I was pushing my body, pushing, probably hanging out with toxic people, doing toxic things for years. And finally, my body was like, well, fuck you. But I remember this. I remember it very clearly, because I'm here telling it to you now, which is, my mom said, your sensitivity is not a curse. It is there as a tool. It is there to serve you, and you just haven't figured out the gifts that it can bring yet, but you will. And sure enough, I feel that, and this is another thing that I've noticed with sort of the empaths and the other highly sensitive, highly intuitive people that I have talked to, is because you sort of find your own people. Even though you attract the energy vampires, you do eventually find people who are highly sensitive like you, and they get it. And especially if you go into, physicianhood, and you're surrounded by people that also want to help people, and they are also highly intuitive people, even if they didn't think that they were, some, like, they didn't even realize it, but they were. I mean, that's why they got into medicine.
Mm.
At least that's why I think that is. I mean,
Especially like alternative naturopathic Chinese medicine, because
mm-hmm.
that's what, you know, that it draws those kind of people, because it's
Yep,
not really the typical well
totally.
paved road. So
Totally. And you know what? I've met some crazy intuitive MDs as well.
mm,
And you were telling me about your dad, who's a surgeon, and he just knew that surgery had to happen, and there was no quote unquote reason for it. He just had a feeling, and that's what
mm,
that is. And I think that over time, empaths become even more intuitive with time, and we have to give space for that. And setting up the boundaries allows us space to make sense of those messages when they come in. It's the same as being able to distinguish your
mm,
own thoughts and suffering from that of another.
mm,
um, is you have to give the space for it. And yes, I think that to a degree, conflict and suffering brings us to a breaking point where we have a euphoric experience. We have an epiphany. I think that could be happening right now. is there's so much pressure, there's so much suffering, there's so much sort of toxic stuff coming up
Mm-hmm.
that it will, people are finding that they're more intuitive even with things that are happening now. And who knows what'll happen a few months down the road after a lot of this toxic stuff has been detoxed, after you've taken the trash out,
Mm-hmm.
and you've gone through that breakthrough of, you hit that breaking point of suffering or whatever that is in the moment, or
I've
that
been finding that
conflict.
for for myself, that because of all the difficulty of these times, all the stress, graduation time, getting everything done, etc., it's actually made me actually find my way again. It's
Mm,
actually reconnected me with my spirituality, my meditation, my mindfulness practices, because they were a necessity.
mm-hmm,
It's almost like when suffering gets to such a point where you have to grow or else
mm-hmm.
just devolve, the
Yep.
necessity of it can drive you actually into really great things, like that euphoria or epiphany at the max point of suffering. I mean, ultimately, I guess the goal is to not have to get there, but a lot of times that's the only way to get there, you
Well,
know?
yeah, and that's the only way to grow.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no way that, even if we wanted to stay in our comfort zone and stay stagnant like we're experiencing now, growth is thrust upon us, and we can choose to either level up or be taken out with the trash. I mean,
Mm.
that is that is how I see it. And I know that that's divided and it's extreme, but I don't think anybody's coming out of this the same.
Right. It's definitely moving in one or the other direction. We can't really stay stable. Either we're getting better or we're devolving, and we're always in this kind of cycle, moving between the two. And I think to grow is to do something that you've never done before, because it almost has to be a little bit scary, or else it's not really growth, because it's something that you already know. It's something you're already familiar with, and growth doesn't really come from that. Even that word is a little bit abstract, but it's kind of like with like exercise or weightlifting or something like that. Like, to get really stronger, you have to lift more than you think is possible for yourself. And then when you do lift that, you're amazed. And then
Mm-hmm.
do the same thing the next day, except more.
Mm-hmm.
And
Totally
then that's
true.
growth. But it's always unpleasant because, well, not always necessarily unpleasant. The default mode of the mind is to find it unpleasant. And if you go along with that story, then that's how you'll experience it. But if you have the mindset of, I'm doing something difficult that I haven't done before, and I'm going to try to do it better, then that's a completely different mindset. It makes the pain so much more bearable. And it's,
Well, it's like when I was trying to decide what to do next with my life before I went back to school, and I thought, well, there's no way I'll go back to school. And I thought I had it all figured out. I thought, like, school is such a struggle. Why would I put myself through that? And I had a couple conversations with people saying, one of them is a longtime family friend. And I was discussing, like, well, but if I went back to school, like, you know, the program that I eventually finished, and I was thinking, well, it's going to take at least 4 years, and I'm going to be, 33 when I'm done. And then my friend said, but you're going to be 33 anyway. And I was like, mind, mind blown.
that's right. You,
Because
you could be 40 years old sitting on your couch all the time too. Like,
you're
it's,
going
you're
to
not
be
going to not
40.
age.
Yeah, you're going to be 40 anyway. And I was just like, oh my God. Like, just that comment, little did he know. I mean, he did know. It was super profound, because that's just like the way he is. But he's like a sage like person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I was just like, oh my God. And it wasn't even that, it wasn't like a flashy comment. It was like, you are literally going to be the same age in 4 years,
Mm,
whether you decide to do this program or not. And I was
mm.
not wanting to do it because I was like, well, it's a big undertaking, and it's expensive, and it's going to be difficult, and all these things. But then once I made the leap and started going through it, I realized that, yeah, sure, there was some growing pains, but then I realized the reward that I was getting out of each of those challenges, each step of the way through the program. I started to actually become like addicted to, it was like exhilarating to be like, oh, look, I challenged myself, I overcame the challenge, and now I'm at this next step. And then I can get this to this next step if I take on the next challenge. And each challenge felt more and more rewarding because I was in the program and doing something that I really felt a connection with.
Mm-hmm.
It's clearly not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but it was exactly what I was looking for, and like the type of challenge and the type of unconventional and the type of just variety that I was looking for within the training, that it worked out so well to like constantly be challenging myself and having one breakthrough after another. And I actually became stronger and stronger with each step. And it's interesting because now I don't look at least academic or work type of struggle, I don't fear it in the same way. Interpersonal stuff is different just because it's way less predictable. Humans are so unpredictable
Mm-hmm.
and weird. But at least from like an academic standpoint, like, yes, if you buckle down, if you follow this, if you figure this out, you can do it. It became like, I don't know, it was just like I was building it up for no reason. You know, and I think that we just have to we have to keep seeking and being curious. We can't settle for complaining and not being happy with something and then just letting it be our existence.
Yeah, and you know, no one's gonna come save you if you're in a bad
No,
situation like
I
that.
know.
And that's really, I think that's actually the most difficult thing when you're maybe not feeling motivated or you're having a tough time, is like realizing that like the longer you continue, the more you'll devolve. And there's actually, the longer you wait, the harder it'll be. Like the wait will get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's all
Mm-hmm.
just an illusory wait. It's really interesting how the mind works, and that if you actually do make like a habit of going out and trying to face your fears and searching for that growth, it'll actually get easier. It'll still be scary and it'll still be unpleasant, and some days you won't want to do it, but then you'll realize that like, what are your options? Either you go through just facing that suffering and that fear, or you'll have like a terrible day in another way. Like
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to get out of the suffering. There's no way to avoid it, but it's just a question of what's your, mentality towards it. And I think even at the highest level, from that more kind of sagely perspective, is all of that's an illusion. I mean, most of our problems aren't really problems. Our problems are problems just because we don't see clearly. We don't see the future. We don't know the future. We don't know ourselves. We don't know what we're capable of. We don't really know how to go about it. We don't know what we don't know. So most of our problems can just be fixed by going for a walk barefoot, maybe getting some breaths in and realizing everything that you think is a problem. I mean, you never know which one is actually a true problem, and most of them aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they are, they aren't,
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, from like a mental perspective.
Oh yeah, I mean, from an existential perspective, it's like, what is really any of it?
Right.
Like,
Well, that's the ultimate point. It's like, what problem is there other than inevitable death?
yeah, yeah,
It's like, what's there to complain about in just terms of that? Like,
right.
if anything, that should be the ultimate complaint. Like, oh man, all this, and then it just ends eventually.
Mm-hmm. Or does it?
Or does it? Dun dun dun. On part 3, we talk
Da-na-na-na-na-na-na.
about the afterlife.
I know we already alluded to like the afterlife, or at least recurring lives
Yeah.
in part 1, but you know.
It's interesting too, like, it's interesting that the questions of the meaning of life and the imminence of death, they usually they usually come when you're suffering, really.
Mhm.
When you're engaged and you're living in life, they're not even considerations.
Mhm.
Um, but it's like you need both poles because they're always like reorienting you. Because when things are good, you're kind of, in the flow and you're kind of enjoying. And when things are hard, you question everything.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
question your fundamental choices. And that's good. You should question your fundamental choices because
Right.
maybe you're effing up hugely and you
Well,
won't know unless it gets too bad.
and things can't stay just flowing one direction. We have to evolve. I mean, that's the only way that we can evolve is you have to force that pressure cooker, right? I mean, it's the pattern of all of our lives is things have gone okay and then some shit goes down. And then hopefully the coming out of that is better than it was before.
Yeah. And that's the thing. There's no true easy path.
Mhm.
There's just different kinds of difficult paths. There's difficult paths that are just devoid of meaning because they're not in accord with you.
Mhm.
Or there's difficult paths that are filled with meaning because they are in accord with you. And that's really all that we can choose. I mean, the challenge and the struggle happens regardless, but at least if you're on a path that you feel like you're moving towards something that's true to you and you can reorient yourself to that constantly, this challenge is worthwhile. It's not like a debilitating challenge. It's like that idea of like EU stress, the good kind of stress versus the debilitating kind of stress.
Mhm.
The stressor is the same, whether or not it's debilitating or actually enables you to get more resilient. Is your view towards it? Is this stressor going to destroy me and make me worse off? If you really believe that on a fundamental level, it will. And then you'll
Mhm.
try to avoid it. And then more of those will come. And then that's just that's its whole own path. Um, but if you view it in the more challenge and growth oriented perspective and constantly basically re-propaganda yourself into truth, because like
Mm.
there's so much information about what is right, what is wrong that we pick up from people around us that isn't true. And even uh as your friend was said to you, one little quote of wisdom can completely change everything, completely change your perspective. So
Yeah.
gathering up those little gems of wisdom and like playing them over in your mind and remembering the lessons and keeping track and things like that, they help a lot in turning something that might not be pleasant into something that is actually really fulfilling, or at least keeping something unpleasant from being just like disastrously bad for you,
Mhm.
because that's also possible, because that's where it tends to go. And especially during these times, I think it's really important to kind of
Mhm.
journey within and find our peace in all this emotion, motion, um, uncertainty, all the good stuff that gets the cortisol going.
Yeah, it's a wild ride for sure.
It's basically
Yeah.
you know how like some roller coasters go up and then go down. This has just been like it's just like a down roller coaster the whole time.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's just whoa, oh, this is starting to get, oh, this is exhilarating, oh, it's starting to get
Yeah,
tiring.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Is this ever gonna slow down or stop? Nope.
It seems to be accelerating, but maybe by design,
Yeah, maybe.
you
I
know.
mean, what was
I
expected to happen to some degree, unemployment's at like 15% or something like that, people losing jobs, people disconnected, isolated.
Mhm.
Things are all bound to happen. It's the
Divided.
pressure cooker. Like you
Yeah.
can't put such strain on people and not expect there to be a counter reaction or
Yeah.
something to kind of trigger spark something
Yeah.
true and real,
Yeah.
but sparking all that energy. And it's at the weirdest time too, because the quarantine starts at the peak of the energy, like
Mm.
seasonally. Like spring is like
Mhm.
springing forth energy. And in
Mhm.
Chinese medicine, springs associated with the liver, and like almost like this directed growth, even aggressive energy.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens when you just push it down for like 2-3 months, and then all this other stuff happens? Then it just comes out in this crazy, you know, uncontrolled, chaotic way. So
We'll see where it all leaves us, but in the meantime, you know, we can be intentional with how we want to see things shift, whether it's for ourselves individually or for our society, the whole world. I mean, it's a good time to put intentions out there and then do what we can in our everyday habits and thoughts and practices, just to give a little bit more energy toward making those things happen however we can get that done, you know. It's a time to rebuild because big change is happening. I think a lot of good can come of it. Obviously right now it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good. Even if one day feels okay, the next day doesn't feel as good. So
right.
we have to just, I think, take advantage of this momentum
Mm,
somehow, you know. And that looks
right.
different for all of us. I mean, we're going to feel called to do different things.
Mm,
But remember to, you know, start practicing what your boundaries look like for you so that you don't burn yourself out. You know, there's no point in, the purpose of existing isn't to just go from doing one thing to doing the next thing to doing the next thing. It's, you know, to have intention, to feel connected to what you're doing, to have hopefully a positive impact on the people in your lives, in the world. And so,
right.
you know, having some intention and not just passively floating through life,
Yeah.
avoiding difficult things just because
Right.
us empaths want to avoid conflict. That's not always the best thing to do.
Hmm.
So,
And then having the compassion to yourself too, to
mm-hmm.
have, because like failure is inevitable, you know, like you're gonna mess up, because
Mm-hmm.
but you only mess up if you try. So if you
Yes.
feel bad because you didn't, you know, do something in a certain way, you're halfway there, because that means at least you're aiming for something. So
Right.
just not giving up there and kind of reorienting yourself, doing whatever, you know, thing you need to do to recenter yourself, and then, you know, keep on moving forward in your direction.
And I think that, as you were saying earlier, you know, we can, as intentional as we try to be, to say, to make what our message is sound acceptable to everybody. Obviously there's no way to please everybody.
Mm,
Even if we want everyone to be in harmony, we want everyone to experience brotherly love, we want everyone to reach their highest potential, but that's not the way.
there's no simple answer. I
That,
mean,
yeah,
there's
there's not.
thousands of wisdoms for each of the life's difficulties that you need to
Exactly. And
discover.
so even if it's true for you, in, you still have to do and say what is true for you. And in doing that, you will attract your people. And then the people that are not meant to be part of your circle,
Mm,
part of your life, will fall away, and circumstances will make that
mm,
so. And I think that, you know, for those of us who are highly sensitive individuals, we can't be tiptoeing on eggshells anymore. We can't be afraid of putting up boundaries. We can't be afraid of saying something that might not resonate with somebody, because there's no way to have one thing fit everyone.
mm,
Everyone's, you know,
mm,
it's not going to work for everybody. And that is part of how we move through life, is taking with us what is true to us, and you leave behind the rest.
mm,
And if we all do that as individuals, then, you know, we define the lives that are best for us with the people
mm,
that are our people. And it doesn't mean we don't still come into conflict, and we affect each other and we force each other to grow, but it's, you know, don't just allow somebody to throw toxic energy your way
Mm-hmm.
constantly and just put up with it because you think everyone needs to just be shown
Yeah.
love,
And there's
right?
that secret danger too of not expressing your truth is if
Mm-hmm.
you do that habitually enough, you actually eventually won't even know who you are
Mm-hmm.
because
Or
everything is just
you might make
reactionary.
yourself sick because, you know, you kept quiet. I mean, I know that disease can certainly manifest from not speaking your truth, from feeling like you have to control everything, from taking on the pain of the world. I mean, people become very sick because of stress and emotional circumstances.
Mm.
So we have to think of this as preventative medicine
Mm-hmm.
in living intentionally, um,
Mm.
you know, living your truth, and sort of picking and choosing what you choose to, yeah, picking and choosing your thoughts, picking and choosing the people around you, picking and choosing the actions
Mm-hmm.
that you do, the news you choose to read or listen to or not.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's, I mean, we just have to kind of filter through things. You know,
Mm.
we can't experience everything. It's too chaotic. It's too much. We wouldn't even be able to make sense of it if we were trying to literally experience everything
Mm.
and understand everything. That is not what it is here for. It is for us to choose our own adventures,
Mm.
our
The
own
cool thing
individual
about
adventures.
like wisdom is that it's always true. If it's
Yes.
wisdom of the minds, you know, you could be reading somebody who's having these thoughts about how to live a good life, an orderly life, and they're just as true now as they were 2000 years ago.
Mm.
And those are the things that I now try to fill my mind with, is like healthy, positive, useful thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
not just whatever is there, because there's
Right.
so much that's there.
Yeah.
And you
We
know,
have to
you
pick and
become what
choose.
you absorb, basically.
Yep.
And you don't really have much control over that. The only thing you have control over, I guess, is what you say yes and no to. Like, yes, I'll allow this person in my life. No, I won't allow that person. Yes, I'll allow this way of thinking into my life. No, I won't allow that way of thinking. Yes, I'll allow this book into my life. No, I won't allow that Netflix series into my life.
Well,
Like,
and like
all choosing.
realizing how small, even if it feels insignificant, how we can manifest, as long as we're not getting in our own way, we
Mm,
can manifest. And we start by doing things small. Like if you want to manifest money, you know, say, okay, I want to find $10 this week, and you know, it works. I don't know that it'll work immediately, but I've had enough experiences where little things like that are just the little reminders. They add up to be something significant, because it's kind of like, you know, something out there is getting that message, but you have to craft your intention in a
mhm,
certain way,
right.
like whether it's being very specific or not immediately
Mhm.
counteracting that intention with, well, there's no way I can have that, so, and then immediately you get in the way of that.
And embodying it and
Mm-hmm.
following it through. That's like the
Mm-hmm.
other half of the thing.
Yep.
Um, Manifesting, visualizing, but then actually believing that it's possible, and then
Mm-hmm.
actually doing the things that you at least think or know that will bring you there. So it takes this being a human thing is a
it's
tough
a
business.
it's so weird. It's really weird.
It's very weird. You know what I mean? It's our particular circumstances, though. I mean, we live within society and culture. I'm sure if we just lived in some tribe in the woods, like, we would have problems, but they would be of a completely different nature.
Oh yeah.
You know, even just mental illness in general doesn't really exist in the prevalence that it does in, you know, Western society as it does in different civilizations, different, you
Mm-hmm.
know, tribal societies,
Mm-hmm.
etc.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, well, we've been talking, and we could talk. I feel like we just started getting really warmed up like 2 hours in. So
Oh
let's
my
do another one.
goodness. I'm down.
Yeah. So this
I know.
is
I was like, I don't even know what time it is, but it is. We've been at it for a little bit.
Dr. Angela Hardin. She's a naturopathic physician and resident at NUNM, the lovely school. And I will soon be graduating from there and being cast off into the world of healing to embark on a sea journey on the tumultuous waters of 2020. So I guess we'll do a part 3 then.
Sure, why not? I'm here, you're there.
Yeah.
You know.
For now, as the Buddhists say.
For now, indeed.